OK. Ben, ça me fait grand plaisir.
It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this panel on Quebec, the next steps. We have here the main players, that carry out this change in Quebec. Before addressing the next steps, I would like to say a few words on what we did. I remember in 2011, we had prepared a report with the University of British Columbia for the Alberta government, who wanted to impose the BIM for all its projects in 2012. I was in the taxi in Edmonton, and what we heard on the radio was, you remember the Charbonneau Commission? So the image of Quebec and Alberta was that construction was mafia, the bikers, corruption, all this. Let's say that the climate in Quebec compared to what there was in Alberta was quite different. I would say that there they talked about collaboration, trust, partnership with all the players of the industry, and in Quebec we had distrust and control. Now, what we've done since then is quite extraordinary. What led to this was in 2011 the creation of the multi-sectoral table. Maybe you'll be surprised. It was sponsored by the Agence d'efficacité énergétique, Energy Efficiency Agency, because we were dealing with integrated design in Quebec. So this was done in association with the Private Architects Association, who wanted to gather all of the players. In 2011, we adopted a strategic plan for the implementation of BIM and PCI in Quebec. We did a postmortem at the end of 2016 for this table, and I can tell you that the work that was done was quite extraordinary, because we started with the a climate that was very unfavorable, and someone said that in Quebec we are the Canadian driver as far as the adoption of BIM is concerned. What will happen in 2017 and the years beyond? I will give the word to my panelists. Normally, Guy should start. He already talked a lot. Maybe you have something you would like to add.
Ton micro. OK.
J'ai deux slides, en fait.
I have two slides. Those of you who were not able to read previously, it will give you a second chance to read this slide. It's the same slide I showed previously. These are success factors. Success factors, I will not read them again. If people listen and read at the same time, this is a problem when we have PowerPoint. Success factors were set. You see a few actors here. So these success factors were set and established by all of these members. So we have to work together to address this a progressive and gradual development, will of the people, and collaboration. In fact, don't beat a dead horse. Capacity, you have to give yourself the capacity, and also the knowledge and the skills. So around me, in my entourage, I have to know what I'm asking for. Minimally, you have to be well trained as an owner. Now the other slide. Here, I'm trying to catching up the time I lost previously. I had 5 minutes, so if I get 2 minutes, I'm going to be at 8. So now the deployment issues. Same thing, same slide I showed previously, a little cleaner. So the displacement of the effort curve, all the time we are faced with this. When when you meet with the clients, be it in the health sector or any other field, you have to work so fast. You have to have completed the building for yesterday. We have to give ourselves time for a better planning. So in fact, if you have a good plan, the project will be short. Now the maturity, very important, technological environment. It has to hold water. Especially we have to spend time all together. Integration of new practices, accessibility. It is not a specialist trip BIM. It's for the clients. And previously was mentioned for the Quebec airport, customers have to see it. This would help us to reduce the requirements for changes. Think about your millwork in your kitchen. When you know what you're going to do with these millworks afterward, it will help you. Now, the integration of specialized contractors. This is difficult. Sometimes there are major organizations that buy in, but smaller organizations in Quebec, why do we have a low productivity? Is because there's a lot of fragmentation in the construction industry. In fact, they're all divided, our SMEs. So we won't be able to succeed only if we want at SQE. We have to work all together. Have I catched up my time? 1 minute? No, I would like to invite Michel Guévremont from Hydro-Québec. As Guy said previously, Hydro-Québec was a precursor in terms of these technologies already in 2003 and 4. They bought in. There's the PLM platform that existed because BIM did not exist then. With his colleague, I had a slide.
Okay. Et voilà, donc,
There we are. So good morning. I can talk on behalf of Hydro-Québec Equipment and Constructor, Builder. In 5 minutes, I would like to give you a historical overview, our action plan for 2017, a few summary components or elements. Well, this is important to talk about these various components, and also the strategic vision for the midterm for the following 5 years. If we look, firstly, the history, success stories, we have an ongoing updated mock-up that is followed during all of the construction. So if there are 3D requests for modifications, all this is built in the mock-up, and then we're able to make that accessible for the whole project team. Is that for dams only, or for all of the activities of Hydro? I'm for the builder. In fact, the history, well, yes, it's mainly dams. Historically, with less lines and stations. Then, you know, with the Ordre des ingénieurs du Québec, there's a P7M format. It's a sealed mock-up, and we use a PDF 3D and ARC. It's quite interesting. You have to know that for the signed and sealed mock-ups, for the B7M, we do that for performance contracts. Now, PDF 3D, we used signed and sealed mock-ups for the general approach. So you have to know that 80% of our production engineering work of our project that is done in 3D. So that's quite interesting. And it's going to be at the heart of our internal practices or approaches. And this is what we use with professionals and the builders and the contractors. Then a few success stories. Now, the trends, I'd like to share some with you. In fact, we have a smart team. It's an exchange platform that works very well. You probably heard about it. There's also our collaboration tool. So we use Smart Use for the engineering drawings. It's interesting for us. It works very well. And then we have Reconstitution 3D. We use that increasingly for rehabilitation of the power plants. So 3D scans, also the photos, data points that we use for virtual visits. We also have the virtual reality as such. Yes, it's very fashionable, but we use it more and more since 2016. We have workstations with the virtual reality. And we also have the Googles. We use complete immersion with Googles. So this is very interesting. Mobile devices or technology. We have tools for the sites, digital tablets on the sites to write up reports and to write progress reports. This is automated. So this is historically what was done. So this we've been doing since 2004. So for 2017, there are many components. See, improvement of access to information, access to the files. There are many tools. We used CATIA in the past with Dassault. It works very well for us. Why? It's because it meets the needs. We have components such as dams, heavy mechanic. It's easier for us if we use this software. Now, there is no ideal software. And when we talk about the intermobility of the files and data, so we try to talk to everyone, to all the stakeholders. Then we have to structure the resources. Second point, I think that Guy addressed it this morning. The reality of the 3D, what does that involve? Internally, we restructured our roles with 3D. So we have roles of managers, CAD 3D. This is the term we use internally. So we have integrators, CAD 3D, quality managers for documents, for digital documents. So and modelers, CAD 3D. So we focus on this now. Improvement of the access to the mock-up on site. In fact, we do a lot of things in-house. How should I put it? We're data rich. We have a lot of information. We want to share it as much as possible, if possible. So in fact, these were a few points of this action plan for this year. And strategic vision. All I've said, well, we experienced it for the 4 Romaine, for the construction for Romaine 4. So the strategic vision is phase 2 that's planned. We don't have any announcement for new work as of today, but we have a lot of major work upcoming for rehabilitation. So we'll try to focus now on the rehab projects. It's going to be piece by piece. It's not an all-included thing. So we're trying to bonify the offering of the rehab projects, value-added rehab projects. So there are a lot of upcoming works for approximately 500 million for such projects. And ultimately, the transportation sector will benefit from that. So this is a brief overview of what I want to tell you concerning Hydro-Québec.
Donner la parole à Marc Lapointe. Société.
I'll turn it over to Marc Lapointe, the Quebec Housing Corporation. So I was very much impressed by all of the work that you did on the wood sector, specifically when you were talking about 4.0 building with the industrialization of construction by introducing new technologies like solid wood panels. I think there's some lessons that we can draw from this industry, so I'll turn it over to you. Good morning and thank you. In brief, I'll speak to our operations and practices at the SHQ, and then I'm going to speak about the integration of BIM in our operations, because currently we're in the analysis phase. So first of all, who are we? We provide advice and housing. We also provide housing assistance programs. We're often involved in community projects that meet specific and unique needs. And we also encourage development of expertise in housing alongside all of the industrial knowledge that is associated with this. What we do in housing, currently we're adapting and modernizing the low-income housing park that involves 74,000 units. On average, they're about 30 years old. So we're analyzing the projects, and we're doing energy and consumption audits as well for all of the low-income housing units. And we also own this park. We're responsible for managing this housing stock. As well, we also annually contribute to carrying out, building some 2,500 community building units. To date, it's about 31,000 that have been built since 1998. As to our practices, we have two major practices. First is project management. These 2,500 units will go to tender for professionals who put in a bid. They are hired by a community group, whether this be a co-op or a nonprofit organization, and we provide funding and we provide administrative project management assistance. We have about 100 projects carried out per year. As well, once these projects are completed, we also become partners with the owners. We provide the technical and administrative oversight, whether this be operationally or in project management, as I've just mentioned. In terms of real estate management, we also provide assistance. We help the co-ops. We also provide assistance in the low-income housing unit stock. We have real estate management. There are two parts. We have the advanced practices for the low-income housing management, where we specifically report on environmental development, so we're doing well there. We also do the management of the co-ops and the nonprofit organizations. Some are very good, and some are actually based on volunteer work, so the management is not quite as professional in caliber. To cover all of this practice with BIM, currently we are reorganizing our case-by-case file. We've just heard about this. We had the business case, and we're now looking at the case-by-case file. I can tell you that right now we are doing project analyses. We're carrying out analysis, as was mentioned by the previous speaker. We're looking at wood buildings, prefab wood structures as well. So that is something we have to deal with as part of our project. Of course, 80% is built with wood, and anything that is prefab is also used in family units. So this industry has adopted an industrial development strategy by 2020. We provide assistance there. They now want to adopt measures, among others, to BIM and adapted construction. So this is part of our approach that we implement in our programming. And in terms of the opportunity file or the case-by-case, we're doing a benchmarking analysis for countries that have adopted BIM PCE, and we're seeing that in France specifically, because in France they've developed a BIM approach that is the digital aspect. They're focusing on rolling out BIM specifically to SMEs and very small companies. And as part of their transition plan, they have also developed pilot projects specifically with French social housing. And we find that of great interest. We want to further develop the PCI approach, first and foremost, that is integrated design, before then moving ahead with integrating technologies, because the housing industry isn't quite at BIM yet, and that's a fact. We shouldn't delude ourselves, but there are applications for this. We just need to develop them. But we have prefab. A lot of housing is prefabricated, so a lot of people are involved in wood building and in steel building as well. We're trying to bring them on board into this opportunity file that we want to adopt at our organization. So eventually what we want to do, and what I'm hoping to see, because I'm still at the opportunity phase, that all of the options are open to us, but my own authorities have not yet been settled. We're in the analysis stage, but we're seeing PIM platforms being developed. BIM platforms, we're seeing these public models being developed. This is done for private owners. They choose their own platforms. But if I want to do this at our organization, I have to create a public space that is available to all of the stakeholders, which are very small companies. So these have to be user-friendly spaces. They have to be welcoming. So I do think that this is possible. I think it's a good idea. Nevertheless, we have to have this validated. And once I have completed my opportunity file, I do this. But this is being done in France. Again, that's another example of what is possible. This is a very French, francophone space. Again, we're trying to build a bridge with this and to liaise with the French to see how we can deploy this. Thank you very much. So I think we've looked at some of these success stories. We've looked at different international initiatives, and I think the involvement of owners is very important. We've heard about some of these examples in Quebec, but I think we're already there. However, the issue remains a political one because construction still frightens many of our ministers. We have 3 speakers up here from associations who signed, and I think that's a first in Quebec, a common letter with for Minister Duplessis, so that construction can be taken into account into the digital shift program. There's some $30 million being devoted to this. We want to be involved in this program so that we can re-enhance the reputation of the construction industry. I'll turn it over to Anik Shooner, who is going to speak to this for the first few moments.
Merci, Daniel.
Thank you, Danielle. Just to give us some credibility, I'm here representing the Private Practice Architects Association of Quebec as vice president, but to make my words a bit more credible, I'm also at MSDL Architects, and we do rivet and BIM projects. We've been doing this now for a very long time. Among other things, right now we're working on the University of Montreal Science Pavilion project, which is only among professionals in Revit and BIM. And on site, we're working with a general contractor with BIM and Revit. It's a $250 million project. We worked at the CHU Saint-Justine, $4 million, DCR Schums, and we also do institutional projects. But we're also working on private projects such as the Yule condos complex. That'll be phase 1. That was more than 120 million. We're also doing this in Revit and BIM. So our company works both in the private and public sectors, and we're applying BIM and Revit in both cases. And yet, there are 100 employees in our company, but we represent all of the agencies in Quebec. And let me give you a sense of where we're at in Quebec. We have 1,440 architecture agencies in Quebec. 60% are individual companies. They're run by a single proprietor. 400 agencies are members of our association. 80% of these agencies are structured. The average employees per agencies is 5.4 people. That is, we have a lot of small ones because these are agencies that are basically in Montreal. You have perhaps 400 or 200 people in one company, and ours has 100 employees, and a number have about 60. It's an average of 5.4. That means that there are a lot of small agencies. And the average turnover, the sales is 445,000. per year. 30% have acquired a BIM solution, so we conducted a study. We also did a survey, and a lot of people responded to this. It was very valid. 21 of these agencies used this as part of their mandate. That's interesting because 30% bought it, but only 21% of these companies use it. Some have begun. They became discouraged. They stopped. It's an average acquisition cost of $130,000 per company. And that fluctuates depending on the size of the agency. Obviously, the larger the agency, the more investment. And on average, you can add one human resource full-time to manage this. The situation varies extensively between the large and small agencies. Of course, this seems to be quite obvious. There's something that might not be well known, is that there's a major difference between using BIM and Revit on a private market compared to using it in the private market, in the public. I think that it's much easier to use it in the private sector. When you run a Yule project, for instance, the engineers and architects work together. We work in BIM and Revit mode, but we don't have to comply with any additional requirements from the owner. We do this with the aim of building, but we don't do this with the objective of adding any management issues. It improves coordination of work. It forces engineers to work earlier on the drawing process, and it works very well. Obviously, when you're working with a public client who also wants to use this system to have more control, to hold more frequent meetings, it becomes very expensive and more cumbersome to manage. I'm not saying that it isn't good. It is good, but it's more difficult and it's more costly. Redefining the borders between stakeholders involved in a project. What this means is that as architects, we're used to doing the drawings, then we send them to the engineers. The engineers then use these basic plans. They often complained that they had to clean up the plans, so they were somewhat stuck with the problem of obtaining our drawings and using them to do their work. Now, we need to obtain their mock-ups, and we have to integrate them into ours. So this is very different for the architect and as well for the engineer. And often, in fact, earlier somebody said that it was more difficult for architects to climb up those stairs. Obviously, if we receive the models, or if we get them not at all or later, or once the symbols haven't been adapted, one might have the sense that the architect is unable to move forward. But this is a very different step because this involves integrating all of the models. And what the owner or client must also understand is that the time to issue drawings has increased by a lot. Previously, we were asked to print the drawings and all that. It wasn't very complicated. Today, if it's a major project, it might take 2 weeks because we have to send our model to the engineers, we have to get it back from the engineers, we have to compile all this, do PDFs, and issue it again. So let's stay positive. We've seen better coordination. There's also the need to have a better defined upstream needs and studies, and also we have better defined plans for the owners. There's also a transition period. Some of our concerns is that this transition period involves major issues. For agencies, this requires a tremendous investment in software, in servers, because this is a much more difficult process. It also involves training costs. And in terms of employment, you might have to involve a few full-time people in this. These were jobs that were not necessarily in existence in the companies before. Also, access to tenders. So a requirement in the tender, the fact that you need a very highly experienced BIM manager, and this might disqualify some tenders who can't meet with that requirement. So a lot of the agencies in Quebec are afraid that this is going to reduce their access to projects. Also, there's going to be redefinition of the contractual framework and professional liability. I won't dwell on that, but it has a lot of impact on professional liability of architects. As well, different expectations from the stakeholders involved in the projects and the clients. We need to manage expectations. Sometimes clients think that because we're working in BIM Revit mode, there won't be any extras, there will no longer be coordination issues. That simply we're up in the cloud, everything is running smoothly, there's no longer a human impact. But we must never forget that each project is actually a prototype. I was going to mention the word Bombardier, but it's really not the time to speak about Bombardier. It's not like a company that makes planes and that is going to build prototype after prototype before they sending them out to fly. There are issues. So each building is a prototype. There will always be the human impact. And on site, it isn't because the plans were done in BIM Revit that there won't be any possible mistakes made on site. So what has the association done vis-à-vis BIM? We had an economic study done to analyze the situation to see how we can help our members. We work very closely with the OAQ and the insurance fund with respect to practice and professional liability. In the whole field, we also take part in a sectoral table, as Danielle mentioned, and we put in a request for assistance with the Minister of the Economy, with the AFG, and the CEGQ. Thank you.
Maintenant, tout le monde passe le micro.
Qu'on est intégré puis collaboratif.
Ben oui, c'est ça.
Oui, tu peux prendre la chaise. J'ai deux slides. On s'est coordonnés.
So Pierre and I worked it out together so that we could share this presentation because we're facing similar issues. However, the setting between engineering, where I represent the Association of Engineering Firms, and our company, where we work with Anik, we do have experience. We've worked together, so we have some background. However, the environment that architects work in is different. And let me cite a few numbers that aren't on the slide. There are 22,000 jobs in the engineering field, 227 companies. But what's important to understand is that if you look at companies of more than 100 employees, it's about 1,000 plus. These represent 60% of these 22,000 employees. If I go over 100, it's 80% of the jobs. This means that the size of engineering consulting firms doesn't mean 4 employees on average, as we see with architecture firms. It's much larger. So when we're speaking about a larger corporation, certainly you can invest more. And that's obvious. When you look at the figures on top, a survey was done. It was scientific. It was EB Data who rolled out the survey. Well, simply put, there were 3 questions that were put. It's the importance, is how big the company was. So how important is it to integrate BIM? And it's representative of the size of the company. In other words, this is very important for large corporations. For medium companies, it's almost as important, and it is less important for the smaller companies. And we see that the trends among these 3 questions are the same, is that current integration is fairly extensive for the large companies and the average ones, however, less extensive for small companies. And the 2020 objective is moving towards complete integration of the larger and medium-sized companies. So the ball is off in their court, and as I was mentioning, in fact, in my conclusion, I'll tell you where we think we're going to be heading. We also need to differentiate between the various disciplines. This morning we spoke about building. In terms of structure, for companies that have undertaken that shift, I can tell you that the structure is 80% integrated to date. And why is that? Because there was a benefit to this. Because it was more productive to do this in BIM for the company. It isn't because it was requested by the customer. It's because thanks to technology it was possible, and it was easier to do it for structure than mechanics or electricity. I'm a mechanics guy. And electricity. So that's why it was easy to do it for a structure. In mechanics and electricity, the problems, however, are different. It's the issue of hooking up different networks that becomes complicated. So the penetration rate for companies that undertook the shift is not as high. It's the larger projects that are mainly done with the public institutions. It's required by the owner, but in the private sector, there aren't many requirements. Clients say, yes, we'd like to see it, but do as you like. If you see that there's a benefit to it, go ahead. But there's an obstacle, because we did have a conference call Monday with the companies. So the current obstacle is the availability of resources, because people graduating, as Mr. Forgues is trying to do, is trying to organize training programs, and that's very long. So the institutional machinery that exists to train engineers, technicians, and etc. isn't up to speed yet. The programs aren't there, therefore the companies train their own people. So that's a further investment. We're talking about machines and software as well. There's employee training, and we're not seeing the profitability of the projects because you do project trials and your work methods aren't quite adapted. So you have to accept losing some money on your early projects in order to further develop your know-how. So that's the current situation. Now, the pending file. So the concerns and the current projects, as Anik mentioned, there's the issue of the contracts. As you know, legal experts and lawyers take a long time to do their work. Certainly you can change all the contracts, but it won't be ready until 2025. We have adopted a traditional approach in contracts to develop a non-traditional tool, and you'll find a little box on top which says for whom and by whom. That's very important for us because it's to whose benefit and why are we doing this. This is something that we're currently giving thought to. There's also the issue of compensation, which is currently not adapted to this work method. As we were saying, the structure is beneficial, it's profitable, it's productive, but the architects seem to find that when they put in a bid, they don't really see a difference for the customers, whether it's rivet or non-rivet. We could discuss that. But from the electricity, mechanics, etc. point of view, we're not quite there. So there is an operating principle we need to integrate. We're a little bit the third Revit integration phase. There was phase one, which was about education. People needed to see that Revit existed, and that's what we needed to adopt. And phase two is now over because education has been completed. People are aware. People know how to use the tool. They know how to operate it. We have enough people in the offices available who know how to work with it. Now we've moved on to the operating part. Often PCI is associated with BIM. I don't quite know why. But in our minds, operation means that, for instance, you always have 2D plans. And it doesn't work with modeling. When I do a plan and I draw, I always say, I look at a power outlet, which is on a 2D plan. It has to be visible, and I do it on a 1/20 scale. But when I pull out my model directly without touching it up, I don't see anything. It means that I'm doing a lot of work right now of adjusting it so that I can issue a 2D deliverable good. So we're dealing with the whole issue of design models compared to the construction model. Again, that doesn't make sense in how we plan. So when I've talked about integrated, optimized operating principles, that is currently what we're working on now. We're trying to optimize this. And of course, we want to promote standardized BIM programs to identify the roles and responsibilities in a project. Yes, there is a base project, a base plan that should be used to all projects, and we're trying to standardize the symbols and the terms at the association. We're striking a committee, similarly as was the case for CAD when CAD came out at first, because we had standardized all of the different layers. Right now, we're working on training people on production standards to ensure that it be efficient for everybody. Thank you. Well, we'll close with our builders, dear Luc. I think you have some special powers because it seemed to work all by itself. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you. The General Contractors Association of Quebec brings together all of the entrepreneurs in building in Quebec, of course. We became involved in BIM right away. It was a fantastic opportunity for general contractors to become more involved in the completion of projects. And we were there from the very beginning. As soon as we heard about BIM, we jumped in. And why is that? Because it fosters quality. We're able to optimize quality. We can issue drawings and specs right away. There are fewer mistakes, there are fewer omissions, and there are fewer changes on site as well. Contrary to what people seem to believe, we contractors, we don't like changes. We don't want to see any. We want to build and we want to finish. So BIM is going to help us in that. As well, we're going to be able to optimize costs because we'll be much more accurate. We can do our estimates as well on the basis of BIM tools. And what to say about planning? Planning, of course, will be integrated. We've already begun that work. We'll be able to integrate schedules in the work completion. As you know, for some 15, 20 years, contractors have become much more professional. It's very rare today to see a general contractor who's is not going to have several engineers involved in their team. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was a contractor who would do the work. And now we have all of this new generation of young people, of young engineers who come to us, and they come into our offices, whether they be contractors. And so we have a lot of people. So this generation has contributed and will contribute extensively to the implementation of BIM. So you've seen who our major companies are in Quebec. They are already on board with BIM. In fact, they're engines that drive the rest of the industry in that direction, and ETS has played an important role in this. In fact, an extremely important role with its management department. They have several faculties at the ETS, but management is important. So as part of this management department, they have estimating, planning, and they also use BIM. And we, at our association, became greatly involved. From the very beginning, we struck our own BIM committee. We took part in all of the various meetings. We organized symposiums, conferences, training sessions. We even developed applications. We had developed an app for a logbook on site. We're currently working on a workshop drawing on drawing at the workshop, so we're working on that. So everything that involves management on site. We also are involved in research. At the university, a research was just completed which talks about the obstacles to implementing BIM. So we were trying to understand what could be a hindrance, what could prevent BIM from being implemented both on a legislative, a regulatory level, in terms of code of ethics, culture, and so on and so forth. As well, we just completed a study on the criteria for granting public contracts in construction. So again, we're promoting this. Again, a contract has to be awarded to somebody, and on what basis will this contract be awarded? And a researcher looked at this and was trying to see how this happens elsewhere, and that's just been completed. And right now, we're also working on a study aimed to define the levels of detail required for the specializations. The idea is to bring in our subcontractors and to get them to buy into BIM as well, because we feel that if not, that could be a hindrance. So the best thing would be to get them to become involved in a study. And of course, the challenge is we don't have enough BIM projects, especially for the medium-sized companies. The large corporations are fine, but if we want to provide a service offer to the industry, those who are ready to answer tender, I think we do need to see some involvement in the BIM project. So we're thinking of suggesting some schools, housing, for instance. These are simple projects, and that will enable our smaller companies to become involved in BIM. And of course, we only have a single model. So of course, as concerns training, we immediately jumped on board with the training with our colleague that is Yvon, who I see here. We've heard a lot about BIM, but even at the beginning, we were already in training mode for BIM. So that's an overview for our corporation. Thank you. We have 4 minutes left for our discussion period. We don't have much time left, so let me ask a first question, and I invite the participants here to ask questions. We do have 2 microphones available if you want to ask a question. We asked the panelists what the 2 main concerns were. The first was university training, and secondly was procurement. And in fact, we wanted to hold a training session on this. We had this session. We had a lot of academics who came to this, except in Quebec, because a lot of people here in Quebec didn't come from our architecture schools. So what can we do? First of all, do you think it's important to provide university training? And secondly, how can we go about improving the curriculum? Because at the baccalaureate level, there seems to be a complete wall. They're simply not moving forward. Can anybody perhaps explain this?
I spoke to some people about this at the University of Montreal. You have to understand that at the university level in architecture, the goal is to teach people to create projects, invent projects, to learn all about the architecture component of the project. At the university level, they never taught design, the drawing, technical drawing, AutoCAD or Revit or BIM. That's the difference between teaching or learning about using a tool that changes and learning about architecture and becoming a certified architect. At least when I was in school, I had learned drawing in CEGEP. Most people that I hire also learn it in their CEGEP courses, not at university. The other problem is that in architecture, there's really a pan-Canadian framework that's already established. Architecture schools are inspected. They have to respond to that framework. So now you are adding to the bachelor's or master's or doctorate specific courses, and to try to do that is very complex. After the conversations that we had, I tried to convince the university people to integrate Revit into their courses and to integrate BIM. I think BIM as a principle related to integrated design could be taught. I'm beginning to think that maybe the universities are right. It's not their role at the bachelor's and master's level for architecture. They're not supposed to be teaching software. Maybe it is the role of CEGEPs. And I think that's a more appropriate place to do it because it's a tool. I don't think we should be reducing the role of an architect to the use of a tool. I think the same thing applies to engineering. I think Guy wanted to add something. I'm hearing the concerns that are being voiced. To answer Danielle's question, I think, on the contrary, it's essential. You cannot avoid having university training sessions to demystify what BIM is, what integrated design is. Maybe integrated design is something that they talk about somewhat, but what about BIM? I mean, we are quite a bit further along than having a technology tool. Yes, it's a technological tool, but it's there to share. I was listening to what Luc was talking about. He was talking about contract modes. If he's teaching how things work at universities for contracts, how it works for collaboration, if you're trying to teach all those aspects, if you see that the architects and engineers who are going to graduate and will end up in a private firm or sometimes at the government or sometimes working for a contractor, they should be able to see the overall view of the project and the savings, the ultimate savings to customers and to the public. I mean, I may sound like a preacher, but come on. Maybe it's going to cost a little bit more, and I say maybe. I'm saying maybe in terms of professional fees. But my goodness, when I decided to convince the authorities, I didn't say to them, gee, do we feel like doing BIM? And that's not it. That's not the goal in of itself. The purpose is to make better buildings that will last longer, that will cost less. And who is that going to cost less to? Everyone here in this room, because we're all taxpayers. And if there can be people in universities who teach these things, well, there'll be more decision makers and more people in all these various firms who will be able to make decisions. Well, actually, we're looking for profs at the ETS. Okay, does anyone else want to address this issue? Perhaps I could say something. I am also a lecturer at ETS at the bachelor's level. It's a course towards the end of the bachelor's program. We start talking about it, but people are really curious. They ask all kinds of questions about it. Are you going to tell us about BIM? When are we going to hear about BIM? BIM is really about management, about integration. You would talk about implementation plans. I mean, that's all management. You haven't touched a mouse yet. How are you going to manage? So, management is something that you should be learning at university. Maybe just before you take the mic, Anik, in the survey, 70% of firms said that talked about BIM in schools. Well, BIM isn't Rivet. No, it's not the same thing. I was very clear about saying that I think that integrated design and BIM should be taught at school. Revit as a software may not have its place. That's what I said. And it's hard to find staff that will agree to draw in AutoCAD in our big firms. Young people want to work in Revit. So that's not the issue. The architect has the overall vision. The architect is there from beginning to end with the owner. And that's what he's taught or she's taught at university. But you have to be careful not to mix architecture quality and the architect's talent with the use of a tool. That's the nuance that I'm trying to express. We don't want it to be reductionary. We want it to be an advantage, something added. A lot of people talk about the architecture quality or architecture qualities other than costing less. It's not just, that's not the only consideration in the quality of architecture. It's a tool, it's an advantage. All of our projects are done in BIM Revit unless the owner refuses. And that's the way of the future. But that's not all there is. that's not what it takes. The only thing it takes to build a good building. Well, it's a panel, so we can talk to each other. Yes, and if there are people in the room who want to give their opinion, please feel free. Well, I just want to make sure that I'm not being poorly quoted. It's not just for people who are being trained at university. We're talking about the industry as a whole, people at every level, technicians, operators, whoever. We need Revit operators. Don't ask me how it works. I have no idea how it works. But you need people at all levels to make sure it works, for it to be efficient and effective. Yes, the architect has a global vision of the project, but as owners or clients, we have a global vision of the building from beginning to end. Christian. Well, I don't want the debate to become tool-focused. So is open BIM the solution to put forth for all projects? Does anyone want to try and answer that one? Well, we chose open BIM. Obviously, it's not always easy. If we chose open BIM, it's because we went through a structured process. We looked at proof of concept, and that's what we chose. So, you know, we don't want to choose one company over another. We want to be sure that quality is there. As a client or owner, you know, you have to also think about operating what you build. There's all kinds of software that comes into play in the life cycle of a building. So there has to be some sort of point in common. You have to make sure that all the software can talk to each other. You know, some developers use some things, some contractors use some things. I'm not going to tell them what to use, likewise with architects and engineers. But this is what we've chosen. We chose open BIM. But we are in contact with the others. We have to maintain that contact with industry as a whole. We made our choice. But if after X number of years industry realizes it's not going to work, well, we'll adjust. I'm told that we're already 15 minutes over time, so unfortunately I think this is a very exciting discussion, but we have a very tight schedule. So join me, please, in thanking our panelists.